It's nice to be back looking you in the eye once more as we crack on with a new year of podcasting.
It's very pleasant indeed after a long break and a bit of bronchitis, which is why I sound a bit croaky still.
I just think your voice is on very fine form. I had no inkling that you had an illness until you did a horrible cough, and I was like, oh dear, there might be something under the surface that might appear.
Have you spent Christmas, Sarah, coughing?
Oh,
anyhow. I'm well now and looking forward to a new year. I'm very much looking forward to this episode of the What's on Stage podcast with me, Sarah Crompton.
And me, Alex Wood. And why are you so excited, Sarah?
I'm excited because it's our first ever questions and answers. People have been sending in their questions and we're going to try to provide the answers.
We've only picked 7 or 8 out of many, many questions that came in over the Christmas period. So I think we could save quite a few for another episode down the line if we need to.
Yeah, and some are quite requiring a lot of research. There are 1 or 2 that I'm definitely still working on.
Your research levels have been amazing. I've just sort of hopped onto Wikipedia and then tried to find an answer, but you've gone to horses' mouths.
Yeah, I have. I've been being very journalistic about it and digging around, not least because a lot of the questions that we've been asked about theatrical traditions and stories, it's quite hard to get to the bottom of. Do you want to start with the first question?
Yes, so on Facebook, Nick Stratton and Love Is Always Wise on Instagram both have the same spooky vibes for 2025 in that they've asked, what are the most haunted theatres in London, and are there any that we can talk about? So,
well, we've both been digging on this.
We've been going into the supernatural to find some answers.
There's
quite a few that sort of like are trying to vie for the most haunted crown, I think.
But Drury Lane, Theatre Royal Drury Lane, seems to have the most ghosts. I got up to 9 ghosts, apparently. I've been seen at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane.
Who were the most interesting ghosts that you found?
Well, the thing about the ghosts at Drury Lane is that they seem to be multiple. And one is linked to a skeleton that was found bricked up at the last renovation, not the most recent renovation, which you might come up to. So there was a skeleton of a man. And one of the figures that has been seen at Drury Lane is of a man in grey, I think, in a tricorn hat and short trousers, i.e. knee breeches, which comes to the idea of when it was built, as 18th century theatre. So he's one of them who's been around, apparently, and spotted by multiple people, which is what's interesting about these. You never know with ghost stories whether they're spotted by multiple people because they know there are ghosts or whether they are being spotted by multiple people.
There was reports that producers love it when they see the man in grey because he is associated with good fortune at the theatre. So if the man in grey comes to bless you during your previews or rehearsals, it means that you're onto a winner. I think the team behind Miss Saigon was saying that before it opened there. So yeah, it's nice that these are all benevolent ghosts rather than here to torment our West End community.
Well, that is the interesting thing as you do the research, that they are all benevolent. I haven't come across one that is regarded as malign. Some are more mysterious than others and associated with paranormal activity, but they're not any of them regarded as malign, which is quite an interesting thing maybe about actors and that sense of tradition in theatre. One of the things I read was saying that the reason there are so many sightings is that idea that ghosts, if there are such a thing, imprint themselves on buildings and places where very strong emotions have been felt. And that's why there are so many theatrical ghosts, because obviously the nature of theatre is that you're creating strong emotion every night.
Do you believe in ghosts, Sarah?
Well, I do sort of. When I was a young reporter in Coventry, we ran a series asking people's ghost stories. And of course, Coventry, as you know, is the site, or around it are the sites of a lot of the battles of the English Civil War. And what was astounding about that was the number and similarity of encounters, not necessarily with a ghost, but with something that had happened to people that couldn't be explained by any normal, rational means. And so I do think there is a sense that maybe, possibly, spirits are around us.
Interesting.
And my father worked in a place where there was supposedly a ghost who popped downstairs, and there was always the smell of cigar smoke, and he used to take his place in an armchair and smell of, which is one of the interesting things.
See, I'm a complete denier in
Who are
anything supernatural.
you?
I'm sorry. I
This
think
is probably why I've done more research.
it's all poppycock to me. No, I just think that the human brain is so complicated that it's capable of forming those links that create the visual stimuli. But that's not as fun to talk about when you think about theatre ghosts, is it? His Majesty's is also quite a popular one, apparently, for the supernatural to attend, which makes sense because it's where Phantom of the Opera's on. But there's also, I think there's Herbert Beerbohm Tree, and Tommy Cooper, the former entertainer, likes to play pranks on assistant stage managers, apparently,
Right.
from beyond the grave.
What kind of pranks? What's he up to?
He throws prop fruit at assistant stage managers, because I think there's some props in the Don Juan scene in Phantom of the Opera. But yeah, again, nice that this is all playful and fun.
They're often playful. So Grimaldi, Joseph Grimaldi, the great clown, who is another of the Drury Lane ghosts, people who report seeing him report him joining in on stage and always smiling. And there's that sense of somebody having a nice time. The Theatre Royal York has got a grey lady, which is a ghost of a nun, because it was built on the site of convent, and apparently she appears and wanders through the upper circle on occasions, and there are at least 2 sightings of her.
Wow, well, I think there's also one other, because you've been touring the UK with your research.
I've been touring the UK, so apparently, the most haunted theatre in the UK, I found a 1980s radio programme about this, and it contained a lot of older actors talking about encountering ghosts. And the Theatre Royal Margate is apparently one of the most haunted, with a lot of ghosts, built in the 1740s. And there's a ghost there of somebody who jumped down from a balcony, an actor who didn't get a part and who jumped down from a balcony and died. And apparently they're there. That's a slightly unhappy ghost, though, again, his presence is not meant to be unhappy. I particularly liked a slightly more recent story of the Malvern Festival Theatre, which is a more recent build, which was built to accommodate the plays of George Bernard Shaw. And apparently Shaw's ghost has been felt there, not seen there. And it was an anecdote from Michael Bakewell, who was a radio producer, Joe Bakewell's first husband. And he recounted the way that when he was directing, he went back into a dark theatre one night and all the seats started to flip up in turn. And he thought it might be Shaw, who was grumpy because they weren't performing one of his plays, they were performing a different play. He also said it could have been the wind. So, you don't know, but it was a good story.
That's my interpretation.
And then there's an absolutely brilliant story told by William Franklin, who at that point was performing at the Garrick, and he reported a ghost that was joining in the lines. And this, I mean, I don't know. But they
you
were
might have had too many interval wines, seeing double.
I don't know. He was performing in a comedy at the Garrick, and apparently both he and other actors had the sensation that the lines that they were about to say, which were generally the punchlines for jokes, were being said in the auditorium before they managed to say them on stage.
Wow.
And they attributed that to a ghost. But it might have been a member of the audience, I suppose, who knew the play. You know, like Churchill joining in with Richard Burton's Hamlet. I like that, because they do seem to be active ghosts. They seem to join in theatre ghosts.
My concern is that now that Theatre Royal Drury Lane has had its completely new refurb, have some of the ghosts been evicted?
Yeah.
We need to go back in with a ghost hunter.
Exactly.
To confirm that they're still in
seriously.
residence. I'm worried. My other thought is that actually that's the first of probably 2 stories we'll do about actors jumping from balconies in this episode. Not to be too morbid, but we might revisit that as a point of information later in this episode. But I wanted to move from ghosts to ghost lights.
Oh, yes.
Which is another question from Claire Brown, who asked, what's the original thought behind the ghost light? And I think that this has a supernatural and a very much logistical answer to it. I mean, you can start with the supernatural if you want to.
Well, the supernatural is that it's there to ward off the ghosts. So a ghost light, all theatres have a ghost light, as far as I understand it, which is a light bulb, a very simple light bulb left on stage that is lit when the theatre is dark. And so the supernatural explanation is that it's warding off spirits and ghosts and giving them light. The practical explanation, Alex, which I think you should deal with.
Well, it's essentially to avoid any accidents, especially if theatres have large pieces of set or a pit, you don't want anyone strolling across a stage and then going headfirst down multiple meters into where an orchestra would normally be housed. But actually, some of the research says that it's not to ward off ghosts, it's also to appease the theatre ghosts and to keep them sort of like company, and it means that they know where to go if the ghost light is on. So it's simultaneously to ward them off, but also just to make sure that they're feeling like there's a light left on for them.
I've always found the idea of the ghost light really moving, and it was because obviously one of the other things it does is it both literally and metaphorically never allows the theatre to go dark. Yeah. So the literal practical reason for that is to stop people falling off the stage. And there's this apocryphal story that they came into being after a burglar fell off stage into the orchestra pit. And after that, also Equity like them to be on to avoid accidents in a dark theatre. I mean, that's the same thing. But the metaphorical power of that is that the idea that, you know, drama, art is always a light. And that was very much why during the COVID pandemic, there was a rash online of theatres putting pictures of their ghost lights as a kind of real sign that they didn't want to go dark, that art couldn't be allowed to die.
Yes, there were some really striking photos of completely empty theatres. It kind of sat in a similar space to something like the times when people would sing "We'll Meet Again" and just saying, you know, we'll be back in these theatres, but for now, here's a light that's standing sentinel. It was really quite a stirring image, actually. I remember in mid-2020 seeing photographers going all around West End venues and snapping photos of these ghost lights. So they have really grown in significance over the last half decade or so.
Yeah, it's nice they've come back. As with so many things, their actual start is a slight mystery. I like them as well because they regularly appear in the novels of Nego Marge, the crime novels, which are very, very often set backstage in ghost lights and darkened space on stages. It's often very important to the plot. So I like that.
I think we should stick on a theme of stagey superstitions. John Myers on Facebook has asked, why would you want to break a leg? Which is the common term used when people wish actors or directors or any creative good luck before a performance. So, Sarah, do you know where break a leg comes from?
No.
Does anyone?
Despite my absolutely extensive research on this, it's one of those traditions. Everybody knows it happens. You don't say good luck, you say break a leg. But nobody really seems to have any idea how it started or where it comes from. And Wikipedia quotes a 1939 novel by Edna Ferber as the first recorded use of it. But it's not recorded in quite that context because she talks about understudies sitting there wishing that people would break a leg. And that seems to me not the first recorded usage of it, because obviously they really do want the leading actors to break a leg so that they get on stage. So that feels wrong. And there doesn't really seem to be any agreed starting point for this.
If you had 9 ghosts in Drury Lane, there are about 9 different reasons as to why break a leg seems to have become a thing. The reason that I was mentioning jumping from a balcony earlier is that one of the posited reasons is that when John Wilkes Booth leapt from the balcony after his infamous murder of Abraham Lincoln, that he broke his leg and that was it. But again, that feels like it's very, very tangential at best as to a reason why. Other reasons have thrown it right the way back to the time sort of like of performances in ancient Greece when audiences wouldn't clap, but they'd stamp their feet.
Right.
And actually, if they were so moved by the performance that they would break a leg because they were so in awe of what they were watching on stage that they would stamp so hard that they would break a leg, which, you know, I again feels like how on earth anyone would be able to trace that all the way back to the time of ancient Greeks. I don't know. But have you got any others that you found?
Well, there's one that's linked with a race course, but again feels wrong about people wishing a horse would break a leg. But again, that's wishing it ill, not wishing it well. The one that I am most persuaded by is there's an idea that you broke a leg in the sense that you broke the line of the stage in order to bow, that you put your leg forward in order to bow, which meant you were getting a lot of applause, which meant that your show had been a success. So that is a way of wishing someone luck. And Nancy Carroll, late of this podcast, told me another version of that, which I've not been able to find backed up anywhere, but that it comes from the irons that used to come down on stage, because one of the other aspects of theatrical history we could be talking about is how many fires there were in the 17th and 18th century as playhouses which were lit by either lamp or gaslight burnt down. And because of that, the iron, which separated the stage from the auditorium, was a really important safety precaution. And that in order to take a curtain call, actors had to walk through a door in the iron, which was breaking the leg. It was the iron was the leg, opening the door was breaking it. And therefore, again, you've got the idea that you got multiple rounds of applause if you broke a leg. And that makes perfect sense. But I've no idea at all if it's true.
Other theories include, I think the leg line was the sort of like the line of ensemble members that would try to appear and show, so they'd all queue up, and if you break a leg, it's when you get out of the leg line and get brought into the show. Okay. There was also some theories that it's around Garrick when he was performing as Richard III. He fractured his leg but was so consumed by playing Richard III that he didn't notice, so continued through the show with a fractured leg. And so it's about, if you're so committed to a role and so in that space that you won't notice even if you've broken a leg. Yeah, nobody knows. I love the fact that...
Nobody knows. And it's really odd that it's entirely theatrical. Dancers don't use it. They say maître, which, so I don't know why they say that. But that's the same principle of saying something bad in order to bring about something good. So that's a superstition. Or toi, which is like a good luck charm that you're saying. So break a leg is very actory and really mysterious. Maybe somebody listening to this, maybe an actor, will actually know this answer, but it does slightly defy.
I don't think anyone actually knows. I just think it's going to be one of those things that will hopefully remain a mystery. There's something very lovely about not knowing stuff.
Yeah, and what is utterly fascinating is how many traditions in theatre are mysterious. I mean, the Macbeth tradition, that you can't say Macbeth backstage, it's got two entirely opposite possible derivations. One being that Macbeth was always such a popular play that you didn't say it backstage because it meant that your run of a less popular play was going to come to an end. The other, used in Nego Marsh, is the idea that Macbeth is a play so full of death that it's a bad luck charm. But nobody knows that.
I'd heard that venues programmed Macbeth because it was so popular that if they were in dire straits and looking like they were about to close, they'd program Macbeth because it would be the only show to bring in an audience, but actually they'd go on and close anyway, so Macbeth would kind of be the final play that they ever get to do. So that's why it's kind of, there was a curse around putting on Macbeth. But again, it could be anything, because it wasn't Macbeth that was it Henry V that was being performed when the Globe burnt down. It wasn't Macbeth, was it? Wasn't
Macbeth, no. Oh. So yes, so you would think it would be the play that was being performed when the Globe burnt down, but not.
So I think we should move into 2025 after many centuries of exploration of the supernatural. Holly Robinson, also on Facebook, has asked, are there any shows in 2025 that will be using puppetry, like in Warhorse and The Lion King? And we've definitely been looking through, and I think we found some pretty juicy ones of various different sizes and scales. Where are you most excited for puppetry this year?
I'm very excited for one that's coming out very soon at the London Mime Festival from the 22nd to the 25th of January, which is a version of Moby Dick, huge novel, by Plexus Polaire, who are a French company with an extraordinary reputation in using puppets. They use quite simple puppets to do really, really complicated things. And it's exactly the kind of puppetry that I love. So I think Holly had better book fast to see that one. And also in January at the Peacock Theatre, there is a show called Dimanche by another French company Foucault and Chalouette, which is a mixture of puppetry, live action, dance, and all kinds of different things to tell a story. That sounds quite promising.
Love everything that Mime London does now. I think that's where I've always seen some of my favourite puppetry ever. But we've also got the giant My Neighbour Totoro, which we spoke about on last week's episode, coming to the Gillian Lynn Theatre for a hopefully very lengthy and fruitful West End season.
Which is absolutely fabulous use of all kinds of puppets. And actually, in terms of the question, it does link with Lion King. And I mean, it's big use of puppets.
Yeah, I think it If the
Big
Lion
use
King,
of big carpets.
yeah. If the Lion King walked, I think this doesn't run, it flies in terms of the scale and the ambition. It's amazing. And then 101 Dalmatians is also doing a summer season.
Ah, yes.
I'm not sure if I've never counted how many puppets they get into that one. But also the Little Angel Theatre is a go-to for anyone who loves puppetry. They normally focus on family-friendly shows, but I think the technique and the skill that's on offer there is amazing. So definitely worth a visit.
It definitely is. I mean, it's the most magical place. Home of film director Joe Wright. That's his parents who run The Little Angel. And I think actually if you watch his films, particularly Anna Karenina, you can see the influence of growing up surrounded by magic made by puppets.
So next question comes from Philip Duquette, who is based in Rochester, New York, who sent an email asking he's planning a trip to London in March and has a few tickets booked, but do you have any advice or tips for tourists travelling to London to see theatre?
I always say the same thing, which is boring, but I think, right, you should see one thing at the National Theatre, because I feel, especially for an American tourist, that the National Theatre is a completely different theatre ecology, and it's representative of what British theatre does. One thing in the West End, because, you know, the West End is the West End and thrilling. Perhaps, you know, a musical which will compare with Broadway in different ways and is quite different, I think. And then something that is in a really small, fringy venue. I always say the Yard, which I think you should particularly do now because it's about to close for a major renovation. It always feels like a pop-up theatre, the Yard. It's got the Glass Menagerie on, I think, until April, which would be interesting. But all theatres are fascinating for tourists, and I think you do want to read what's on stage and see what we've recommended. Kiln, I would say, because Kiln's got Lonely Londoners coming up. And Kiln is, again, it's got a unique quality as a theatre. I've been to a lot of off-Broadway theatres in the States, and, you know, a lot of European theatres, and nothing's quite like Kiln, which is both a local theatre and a new playwriting theatre.
I have quite a few opinions. As
Go on,
a
then.
non-Londoner coming into London to see theatre, I am essentially a tourist every time I come to the West End. First of all, I'd say cheapest coffee, go to the Phoenix Theatre Cafe. You can get a £2 oat milk latte. Totally agree about going to an off-West End venue. When I go to New York now, I always go off-Broadway. Not because I'm edgy and cool, but because I think it's
You
where...
are edgy and cool.
Well, it's where the cheaper shows are, and you can see things before they hit Broadway, and then you can brag about seeing them first. So go somewhere like the New Diorama or the Bush would be my other two favourites, and especially the New Diorama's within walking distance of the West End. So if you're lazy like me, it's the best one to go for. I would say that day seats are a good pick if you want to get a bargain, or if you're spontaneously looking for a show to see. Food-wise, interestingly, I think that the West End is missing a good eatery post-show. I think it needs to be somewhere like a good drinking hole where theatre communities can congregate afterwards. In the same way on Broadway, there's so many places you can go to certain bars and then you'll just see Tony Award winners sitting there trying to drown their sorrows. We don't really have somewhere like that in the West End. It used to be
Joe Allen, but it hasn't. The new Joe Allen's not quite the same. It's interesting, but it is still a good choice.
I totally agree about Joe Allen. It's like steeped in theatre folklore. I'd also say somewhere like Curb at the Understudy at the National does great food very quickly, and they've also got some new restaurants there that are fun. Also, Sophie's is a great bar, does great pre-show food, and that's just off Shaftesbury Avenue. And one final, actually, it's coming into its own now that Christmas is over, but the terrace at the Royal Opera House that looks over Covent Garden is possibly the best place to get a drink, especially if you're not seeing a show, or probably just before arrivals start at 6. So if you're going mid-afternoon, it's so quiet and has amazing views over Covent Garden, and you get to go through the Royal Opera House to see it, which is a beautiful venue in and of itself. So that's my hidden gem of
it would be my hidden gem. Oddly, the other thing I do with the terrace, I love the terrace because you can just go and sit there at any time of day, and I do sometimes sit in a chair in the corner and have a snooze if I've got a show in the evening. So if you see somebody asleep in a corner, it's probably me. I agree about all your recommendations. The other eatery I like is the Young Vic bar, which quite often has a changing menu, and I quite often find something I enjoy there. So that's my tip. And I think the other thing is really just day seats is a brilliant way of seeing things. Don't think things are sold out when they say they are, because you can very often pick up a return. And a lot of shows on the day will offer cut price tickets.
It's almost a shame now that Guys and Dolls has closed, because that used to be my go-to recommendation for a day seat, because they normally had standing seats left for anyone that was willing to brave it in the pit at Guys and Dolls, but now that's gone. So I'll need to find a new go-to recommendation.
We hope that helps.
Yes. So another email, this time from Chaz Alexander Smith, who asks, can you talk about how you expect the National Theatre might change under its new directorship once Rufus Norris leaves? And as an aside, how did it change under Norris post-Heitner? So this is about Indhu Rubasingham's time at the National, which is essentially starting around now-ish. We've got her programming coming soon. And before we get into this question, I want to recommend any listener check out Sarah Crompton's brilliant interview with Indhu in Vogue, probably one of the most comprehensive interviews with a theatre leader in 2024, and essential reading for anyone wanting to know what's coming at the National Theatre. Sorry, Sarah, I thought I'd flatter you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's very kind of you to do it. It was a brilliant interview, and she is a brilliant, vibrant person, and talked about what made her love theatre as well as what she hopes to do with the National. And it was a wonderful conversation, and I do recommend it to anyone, not because of me but because of her.
Oh no, I think because of you as well. I feel like we should probably tackle the second part of this question first. So how did the National change once Rufus Norris took over from Nick Heitner?
I think the interesting thing about the National is that though it is very much an institution, see previous answer, it's also radically altered by the personality of the person in charge. And I think with Rufus taking over, Nick Heitner had been an incredibly successful boss of the National. And when Rufus stepped into it, he's a much quieter personality. And he was also then hit by the COVID epidemic. And so he's had a slightly tricky time when he took over. And in some ways, I feel quite strongly that that has obscured the really radical changes that he's made and the sheer quality of the work that he has produced. One of the things he definitely did, which was different, was to make it the National Theatre in terms of working very, very closely with the regions, to say, we can't move from London. So what can we do to encourage theatrical work across the regions? What partnerships can we develop? And he's done brilliant things with that, I feel.
Beyond that, what was interesting is how many of those regional works were developed at the National Theatre Studio, which was essentially his baby to some extent. It's the dedicated space on the cut. It has this expanse of rehearsal rooms, but also a library of archived plays and text, many of which are unperformed, and he's brought new writing right to the heart of what the National is. Obviously, the National has always been a place for new plays to premiere, but I think he's not just seen it as a place for plays to open, but also for plays to be cultivated and developed. And you hear about all these projects that never see the light of day, that actually get weeks of rehearsal or workshop time at the National. And that's incredible as an institution to be able to give creatives their blessing. And I think this might be something that we see going forwards as well.
Yeah, I think very much he's made it a resource for the whole nation. And he has increased the diversity and variety of voices, backgrounds that bring work to the stage and perform work on it. And that's noticeable. And his play choices, of course, have been entirely different. And Indhu's play choices will be entirely different again. She will look to do other things and start to mould it in her shape. But I think you're right that probably new writing will stay at the heart of the building.
We can kind of look at her tenure at Kiln in North London, which you mentioned earlier, and see what you can infer from that as to what she might prioritise. New writing obviously being a great thing, and she's helped bring about some brilliant new plays that have transferred into the West End and beyond. All started their life at the Kiln. So hopefully that again can happen now that she's at the National. I think, like you say, maybe an international scope?
Well, one of the things she said in the Vogue interview was that she wanted to make it a national theatre with an international reach. And I think that is one of the things she's identified early on as something that she can make a mark of difference. She has invited the playwrights Lynn Nottage and Ayad Akhtar, with whom she worked at Kiln, who are American playwrights, major figures in American culture, to become associate artists at the National and to act as sounding boards and supporters, really, ralliers for new ideas and a different reach. She's got plans to work with people like Coleman Domingo, who she's worked with before, and to bring their work into the National. So I think that she's interested in that and interested in just making a richness of voice and work on the stage, which all her background indicates that she's good at. She likes a wide range of theatre. She loves musicals, she loves new writing, she loves classic plays. She said that she feels that theatre is her partner in a way. It's the thing she cares about so passionately. And I think that's going to be interesting, the range of work. We might talk later when she's done her first season about the challenges she'll face. I think there's a real challenge around classic work, but I'm quietly confident that she will climb over the challenge and start to produce things that everybody talks about.
She's inheriting quite a precariously placed position that her predecessors never really had to grapple with, which is, you've got those COVID loans, you've got heavy scrutiny of subsidy. So in a way, she has to become not only an artistic director, but also an advocate and a campaigner, which, wearing so many different hats, which she has already done incredibly well. But in a way, she's got, that does make the role harder than it probably has ever been before. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why Rufus thought, okay, 10 years was enough. I can call time here. I've seen things through the pandemic, but know that, I've done an incredibly good job, but it's not like it's going to be plain sailing for anyone taking over.
No. And I talked to Nick Heitner when I was doing the Vogue piece, and he said that he felt that the pressures on the boss of the National Theatre are even greater than in his time. That there are so many roles you're fulfilling of advocate, of spokesperson for the entire theatre culture in the UK, of fundraiser, of social media communicator, and being a director still. The weight on you gets heavier and heavier. He's very excited about what Indhu will bring, but equally all of, he and Rufus are conscious of the weight that will go on her shoulders. I mean, they know better than anyone just how tricky it is to run that building now, and to solve all the problems of theatre in the 21st century.
I'm so excited to see what the National Theatre at the end of 2025 will be, because we've got half of the year's worth of programming from Rufus Norris already, and we've discussed that on a previous episode. The big shows that he's bringing back are his greatest hits to some extent. You've got the Dear Englands and the London Road. So at the moment, we don't know really, in the bigger venues anyway, what the new stuff will be, capital N, capital S, which is really, really interesting now that the National Theatre's identity is very much up for grabs already. And I know that Indhu's already been working incredibly hard assembling what will surely be a treasure trove of work that we can discuss at length on the podcast.
I know, and she wants to keep directing, and which is fascinating, because reading all the diaries of all her predecessors, it's always the keeping directing that puts the most pressure on them, and they all collapse in misery and agony as they feel that their own plays flop. And I mean, she has, as a director, produced some of the National's most interesting new work, The Father and the Assassin being a notable case, which was, she's very good at directing in the Olivier, big space directing, sort of epic. So that's exciting to see what she will direct, as well as what she will bring in from other people.
Right, should we move on to another question then? I think actually you've been quite proactive with this one already. So Iris Barrett asks on Facebook, are all stages the same size? And when shows tour, does the set fit every theatre?
No. So I rang my friend Simon Higlett, who is a designer who has done a lot of work at Chichester, world-renowned designer, wonderful, did the tour of Chichester Bang Bang, and he and I gave a talk. Well, I asked him questions and he talked about that tour of Chichester Bang Bang, which is why I rang him to ask his advice on this. And he is an expert on designing for touring. So a lot of his work has moved around. He's currently designing the tour for Man for All Seasons with Martin Shaw, but he's also working on a show with Derren Brown, the illusionist. And that show with Derren Brown will have to move from Cardiff, which has 3,000 seats, to Brighton, which has 700. And in that kind of range, he is actually having to design two slightly different sets. But normally what he does on any production that he is engaged in is design the show to fit the smallest space. And then it will be expanded to fill larger spaces. So he might alter the height and the width of it, but he will tend to leave the acting area the same, because actors do not like suddenly being asked to walk 4 paces more because the size of the stage is different. So it's a really interesting proposition of how he fits things in and how then he uses the wings and the sides and back of the set to fill out in greater areas. But it's all planned in advance. It's all done with model boxes and so on. And then we went on to talking about the different kind of shapes of theatre. In fact, the shape is broadly the same. The vast majority of theatres in Britain are still proscenium arch and very often designed by Frank Matcham. And those theatres fall into 3 different scales of big, medium and small. But they're all designed according to the golden mean of having a proportion in terms of the width of the stage in relation to its height and depth. Most of them have a width of between 24 and 26 feet. And the height is then worked out in proportion to that. Something like Theatre Royal Haymarket is different because instead of being a landscape picture frame, the Theatre Royal Haymarket is a portrait picture frame where it goes very, very high.
Yeah.
And you can see that. Theatre Royal Drury Lane also goes very, very high. But they are designed in proportion and relation to the houses that they face. They do really work as theatres in which to stage things and theatres in which to design things. Something like the Ivana Arno in Guildford, which is your local, was a victim of the 1960s, where suddenly people started to redesign theatres, and it's very, very low, looks a bit like a letterbox, and that's harder to design for. So they do range massively. And the other thing he said that was interesting is the tour, the Man for All Seasons tour, is going to Chichester. And of course, Chichester, like the Olivier, is a thrust stage. Chichester was designed so that Laurence Olivier could muck around with the theatre that he was building on the South Bank, and so that they could practice productions there. When a tour that has been designed for proscenium arch arrives at a thrust, you have to make decisions about what you do with it. And you either take the sides off completely and let it just move forward on a like a box, I guess, or you create a different width at the back. Yeah. So there are challenges involved in all this.
It's honestly one of the most fascinating things I've ever experienced with touring shows. Especially my most extreme example was I went to see Amelie the musical at the new Wimbledon Theatre, which is a 1,600 seat venue. And you think this production was originally staged for 220 people. So now it's being presented to almost 8 times that number.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I think it just about worked.
I think we should get Simon on the podcast because he's a brilliant talker about design. But I think it's really interesting that you can go small to big, and it's much harder to go big to small.
And you can also be quite creative with cloths as well to artificially restrict your stage space in a way that people might not notice.
At time of recording, I'm fascinated to see Oliver
Yes.
at the Gielgud, because I've seen it at Chichester where, the set works perfectly on a thrust and makes such use of the cloths and moving. And I can't imagine quite how that is going to work on the Gielgud stage. So that's interesting. I think it's a kind of real theatre nerd thing, but the more you watch design alter according to space, the more interesting it is. It's fascinating looking at the national stage, how a lot of designers have started really to use the height there. And I was talking to Simon about Drury Lane as a stage, and that, because it was essentially designed not for Shakespeare, not for straight drama, but for vaudeville and different things, it's very hard to make that space work because it is so big and so high, which takes us back to what Jamie Lloyd will do when he's putting much ado into it.
Well, so I think with this sort of bumper Q&A episode, because there's so many brilliant questions that we've been fielded. I've learnt so much about theatre. I think we need to definitely do another one of these soon.
Keep your questions coming on email at
feedback@whatsonstage.com, or you can drop us a message on any of our social media channels and we will be sure to pick up your questions.
And in the meantime, we'll be back next week with a regular episode. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Sarah Crompton.
And a goodbye from me, Alex Wood. Make sure you like, follow, subscribe, or leave a rating wherever you can for the What's on Stage podcast. We'll be back next week. Have a great one.